Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters spent its first several years building a very particular kind of momentum, one that depended on a delicate balance between two things that shouldn't have worked together as well as they did: the mechanical, almost sports-like tension of a card game, and a slow-burn mystery about ancient Egyptian magic, lost memory, and a nameless spirit sharing a body with a teenage duelist. Duelist Kingdom established the stakes. Battle City refined them into something close to a perfect shonen tournament structure, with a real bracket, real rules, rivals whose motivations were sketched out with care, and a mythology that unspooled a little more with every major duel. By the time Battle City reached its climax, the show had trained its audience to expect a specific rhythm. A duel begins, the personal history behind it is revealed in flashback or dialogue. The mechanical back and forth of the card game supplies tension, and the resolution either advances the Egyptian mystery or deepens a relationship between characters the audience already cares about. It's a formula, but it's a formula that had been sanded down until it worked with real elegance. Then, before the Egyptian mystery even reaches its own promised climax, the show detours into an entirely different story, the Waking the Dragons arc, built around a villain named Dartz, a drowned civilization called Atlantis, a magical stone called the Orichalcos, and a world-ending entity known as the Great Leviathan. It is one of the longest continuous arcs in the entire anime. It introduces one of the more well-regarded villains in the franchise's history by many fans' accounts, and it is also almost universally cited as the arc that feels like it wandered in from a different show. Understanding why requires looking at several separate but related problems. A tonal shift the series never quite earns, a competing mythology that sits alongside the established one without truly connecting to it. A structural repetitiveness that padding conscious viewers can feel duel after duel. A villain whose personal tragedy is weighty enough to eclipse the protagonist's own ongoing arc. And finally, the practical behind-the-scenes reasons an arc like this exists at all in an anime adaptation that was, at this point, running ahead of the pacing its source manga could support. Start with tone, because it's the most immediately felt of these problems. Yu-Gi-Oh! Was never a purely lighthearted series. From its earliest episodes, it flirted with genuine darkness, shadow games that could burn out a person's mind, penalty games that punish cheaters and bullies with visions of hell, a spirit possessing the body of a teenager because of some unspoken debt from 3,000 years ago. But the show always kept a buoyant shonen energy running underneath all of that darkness. Jokes about Joey's stomach growling, Tristan's exaggerated crushes, the Millennium Puzzle's magic treated with a kind of wonder rather than dread, rivalries that, however heated, usually resolved into mutual respect rather than lasting trauma. Even at its bleakest moments, Battle City maintained a sense that skill, friendship, and cleverness would ultimately carry the day, and that losing a duel, while dramatic, would not cost a character their soul, their sanity, or their life in any permanent sense the show was willing to dwell on. The Dartz arc abandons much of that underlying buoyancy. Souls are lost, and unlike the temporary Shadow Realm stints of earlier villains, these losses are framed as complete and possibly permanent. Characters are shown as husks, catatonic, their personalities apparently gone. The emotional register of the arc leans hard into grief, sacrifice, and existential dread rather than the excitement of competition. Characters we've watched banter and bicker for years are suddenly deployed as martyrs, sacrificing themselves one by one in duels they know they're likely to lose, simply to slow Dartz down. The visual language shifts too. Darker palettes, quieter and more somber scoring, extended sequences of characters standing in grief or resignation rather than the fast-paced back and forth of a normal duel. None of this is inherently bad. Many excellent stories use exactly this kind of tonal pivot to signal that stakes have changed and that the story is entering its endgame. The trouble is timing and framing. The shift arrives abruptly, wedged between the competitive energy of Battle City and the eventual return to a lighter tournament-based structure afterward, and the show never really acknowledges the whiplash. It doesn't earn the darkness through a slow escalation the way, say, a longer-form drama might. It simply drops into a grimmer register for dozens of episodes, and then climbs back out as though nothing happened, the cast returning to easy banter almost immediately once the arc concludes. The tonal shift, in other words, feels imposed on the story from outside rather than growing organically out of it. This leads directly into the second, arguably larger problem: mythology. Yu-Gi-Oh! Central mystery, the engine that drives essentially every major arc up to this point, is ancient Egypt. The nameless pharaoh sharing Yugi's body, the 7 millennium items, the fractured memories of Yami Bakura and Yami Merrick, Sito Kaiba's obsessive conviction that he was once a priest named Sito in a past life, the eventual promise that all of this will resolve when Adam recovers his true name and his memories. This is a tightly wound, singular mythology. Everything traces back to one ancient civilization, one magical catastrophe, one set of artifacts. It's dense, sometimes contradictory in its details, but it is, at its core, one story. Dartz' arc introduces a second, largely unrelated mythology on top of it: Atlantis, a lost civilization far older and, crucially, more powerful than ancient Egypt, the Orichalcos. A stone capable of overriding the game's own rules, the Great Leviathan, a godlike entity whose scale dwarfs anything the Egyptian mythology has offered so far, and a backstory involving an ancient war between humanity and monsters that predates the pharaoh's own civilization by a wide margin. On its own, this could have been an interesting expansion of the show's cosmology. The problem is that it doesn't expand the existing mythology so much as compete with it. If Atlantis predates Egypt and its magic is powerful enough to threaten the entire world in a way the Millennium Items never quite managed to on their own, it implicitly diminishes the stakes of the mystery the audience has been following for years. Why should we care as much about the pharaoh's memories and the fate of the Millennium Items if there was an older, bigger, scarier, magical civilization out there the whole time that the story never bothered to connect to it? A well-integrated expansion of a fictional universe usually finds a way to make the new material feel like it was always implicitly there. A piece the audience simply hadn't been shown yet. Atlantis doesn't do that work. It sits beside the Egyptian mythology rather than folding into it. There's no meaningful suggestion that the Egyptian priests knew of Atlantis, no revelation that the Millennium Items and the Orichalcos share an origin, no lasting change to how the audience is meant to understand the pharaoh's own backstory once the arc is finished. And once Waking the Dragons ends, Atlantis and the Orichalcos essentially vanish from the narrative. They are barely referenced again in any of the story's later, climactic arcs, which return fully to the Egyptian mythology, as though the previous several months of story had been a self-contained detour rather than a building block. That absence afterward is itself telling if the writers didn't feel the need to carry Atlantis' implications forward into the ending they'd been building toward all along. It suggests the arc was never meant to be structurally load-bearing in the first place. The third problem is one of pure structure and pacing. Waking the Dragons is a long arc, and a significant portion of that length comes from a kind of repetition that becomes more noticeable the longer the arc runs. The basic shape of most of its duels is consistent. One of Dartz' 3 lieutenants, Raphael, Alistair, or Valon, corners one of Yugi's friends, invokes the Seal of Orichalcos to power up a monster and lock the loser's soul away as the price of losing, and the hero in question must find some clever, often last-second way out, frequently at great personal cost. This structure repeats across Joey's duel, Mai's duel, Kaiba's duel, involving his brother Mokuba, and beyond, and the sameness of the stakes each time flattens the tension rather than escalating it. In Battle City, every duel carried a different prize and different personal history, a rare card, a piece of a puzzle, an old rivalry, a family grudge, a locator card needed to advance in the tournament. Each duel felt distinct because what was actually at risk and why changed from fight to fight. In the Dartz arc, the risk is essentially always the same. A soul, presumably lost forever, which means that after the first 1 or 2 instances, later duels have to work harder to generate the same emotional impact, and mostly do so simply by escalating the melodrama around the stakes, rather than by varying the stakes themselves. Combined with a fairly linear endgame, free the Leviathan, contain the Leviathan, defeat the Leviathan with the power of the Egyptian god cards, the arc can feel padded. A lot of screen time spent on individually similar confrontations in service of a conclusion that could plausibly have been reached in a shorter span. It isn't that any single duel within the arc is poorly constructed. Several are considered highlights of the series by longtime fans, but that the arc as a whole asks for a degree of narrative patience that its underlying plot doesn't quite justify. The fourth problem is subtler and has more to do with the show's protagonist than its villain. Dartz, by the standards of Yu-Gi-Oh's Rogues' Gallery, is unusually well developed. He isn't simply a power-hungry cult leader or a cartoonishly evil figure. He's a man who watched his kingdom and his family destroyed by his own hubris thousands of years ago, who has spent that time convincing himself that erasing humanity's capacity for negative emotion, the very thing he blames for the original catastrophe, would be an act of mercy rather than tyranny. That's a legitimately compelling premise for a tragic villain, and it's part of why so many fans remember Dartz fondly even while criticizing the arc's placement in the overall story. But that same strength becomes a structural liability. Dartz' tragedy is older, larger, and, frankly, more emotionally weighty than anything happening to Yugi or Adam at this specific point in the story. Adam's ongoing arc up until this point has been about identity, a spirit who doesn't know his own name, piecing together fragments of a life he can't fully remember, aided by a group of friends who care about him regardless of what he ultimately turns out to have been. That's a comparatively intimate, character-driven arc. Dartz' arc, by contrast, is civilizational in scale, the fate of humanity itself, the weight of an entire lost kingdom, an ancient war fought with god-tier monsters. When these two arcs are placed side by side, the smaller, more personal story of Adam's identity gets crowded out by the bigger, louder story unfolding around it. The show effectively pauses its own protagonist arc to let a guest villain's older, sadder story play out to its conclusion. When Waking the Dragons resolves, it resolves Dartz' arc, his redemption, his release from guilt, his acceptance of peace, rather than advancing Adam's. The Pharaoh doesn't learn anything new about his own past during this stretch. His mystery is simply held in suspension while someone else's story concludes around him. That's an unusual thing for a shonen series to do with its own protagonist for such an extended stretch, and it's part of why the arc can feel, in retrospect, like a very well-made story that happens to be borrowing the main character's show to tell itself in. It's worth asking, finally, why an arc with all of these friction points exists in the first place, because the practical, behind-the-scenes explanation goes a long way toward explaining the aesthetic experience of watching it. Waking the Dragons is an anime original arc. It has no equivalent in Kazuki Takahashi's original manga, where the story moves directly from Battle City into its climactic Egyptian arc without any detour through Atlantis. The anime, however, was airing on a different schedule than the manga was being written and published, and needed additional content to avoid catching up to and outpacing its source material. Waking the Dragons was, in large part, built to serve that practical need, to buy time, to give the production additional episodes to work with, and not incidentally to justify a wave of new merchandise, since the arc introduces an entirely new mechanic in the Seal of Orichalcos, along with a roster of powerful new signature monsters for Dartz' lieutenants and for Yugi's friends to use. None of that is unusual or scandalous by the standards of long-running anime adaptations. Plenty of beloved arcs across many franchises exist for exactly these commercial and scheduling reasons. But content created primarily to solve a pacing problem behind the scenes will often, quite naturally, sit awkwardly next to material that was designed from the outset as part of a single disciplined plot. That's essentially the situation with Dartz, an anime original arc built with real craft and a genuinely compelling villain, but conceived and executed somewhat independently of the story it was inserted into, and it shows in exactly the ways described above: tonal whiplash, a competing rather than complementary mythology, repetitive structure, and a protagonist whose own arc gets sidelined by a guest character's resolution. None of this is meant to suggest that the arc has no value or that it fails on its own terms. Many longtime fans rank Dartz among the franchise's best-written villains precisely because of the tragic depth described above, and the arc gave several members of the main cast, Kaiba in particular, forced into a rare position of vulnerability and self-sacrifice, some of their more memorable material in the entire series. The animation and direction, freed briefly from the show's usual visual conventions, took some real risks that paid off in isolated moments. Taken as a self-contained story, Waking the Dragons holds up reasonably well. The issue has never really been the quality of the arc in isolation, it's the fit. A story this tonally heavy, this mythologically expansive, and this centered on a guest villain's resolution, rather than the protagonist's ongoing journey, was always going to sit uneasily inside a series that had spent years training its audience to expect a very different kind of rhythm. One built around ancient Egypt, around Adam's search for his own name, and around tournament structures with clearly defined stakes. Dartz's arc is powerful, ambitious, and in many ways well crafted, but it remains, in the end, a story that belongs to itself more than it belongs to Yu-Gi-Oh! And that disconnect is exactly why so many fans, even those who enjoyed it, come away feeling that it never quite fit into the larger story being told around it.